All right, everyone, welcome to the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University's virtual event on The Perfect Weapon. I know many of you have seen this film. I'm grateful to be here with David Sanger and Amy Zegart, the person from whom the film was adapted in his book, The Perfect Weapon, and one of the stars of the film, talking about this new world of cyber operations. For those of you who don't know, my name is Ben Buchanan. I'm a professor in the Security Studies Department, teach classes on cyber operations. I am not in the movie, but one of our other professors, John Holtquist, who many of you have had, is in the movie talking about his favorite subject of Russian hacking. We'll get into that and a lot more over the next hour and 15 minutes. Just very brief introductions of our two guests. David Sanger is a national security correspondent at the New York Times. He's had a wide variety of positions over the years at the Times, has broken some of the biggest stories on cybersecurity, including one that we'll discuss in just a little bit that was posted just minutes ago. Amy Zegart's Senior Fellow, former co-director at the CSAC Center at Stanford. She's written a number of books on political risk, intelligence reform, and she's edited a book with Herb Lynn, Bytes, Bombs, and Spies on cybersecurity and this new age of statecraft. I don't think we could come up with two better people to have this discussion with. David, I want to start with you. One of the things I think that's most remarkable about this film is that it takes a subject that I think is hard enough to convey in words. And all three of us have written about cybersecurity, and we know it's an abstract and tricky thing to talk about. And somehow it does it not just with words, but also with visuals, where it's even harder because code is kind of ephemeral. I'm curious if you could tell us how this all came to be, both your reporting on the subject, your book on the subject, and then ultimately turning into a film. What had to happen to get us to this point where we've got this great documentary on the subject?
Well, first, thanks, Ben, for having me. Thanks for having me back at Georgetown. I love the Georgetown campus. And when I'm in Washington and when students are there, I love coming over and talking to classes there and learning so much from all of you. And thanks to my friend, Amy, who has taught me a huge amount in this territory and who, as you pointed out, was one of the stars of the film. As soon as we started to go figure out who could explain this stuff really well and really vividly, like one of the first names I put down on the list as we were in the production meetings was Amy's. And Ben, we'll have you in the sequel. We just, we didn't want to have too many groupies coming after, this all at one time.
I can't compete with Holtquist anyway, so it's all right.
Yeah, he's got that beard, So I began working on this subject, when I started at the Times, as you said, too many years ago, I was right at the intersection of technology and business reporting and so forth, and covered the introduction of the first Apple personal computers and IBM's entry into it and all that. And then I went to Japan as a foreign correspondent, where obviously I was dealing a lot with what we thought at the time was existential threat. We had the threat right, we just had the country wrong. But and then came back, and I've really done a lot of work even while I was doing my White House correspondent work and as chief Washington correspondent in this intersection between technology, policy, and national security. But when I was working on my first book called The Inheritance, which was about what George W. Bush was leaving Barack Obama, and it came out just a few weeks before Obama was inaugurated for his first term. I had spent a fair bit of time with Mike McConnell, and the Director of National Intelligence, and others who were trying to wake the government up to the breadth of the cyber threat. And this was just around the time that the Russians were breaking into defense establishments in a big way. It was just at the time that people were thinking about what U.S. Cyber Command could ultimately be. At the time, it was still part of Strategic Command. And that book broke the news that President Bush had authorized the first cyber operations against Iran as an alternative to the fear that the Israelis would go bomb the Natanz nuclear enrichment site. That meant that we were pretty alert 2 years later when the Stuxnet worm began to escape around the world. And that led me into a 14-month-long investigation that uncovered the depth of this Israeli-American cooperation in an operation, a classified operation called Olympic Games, which Amy also describes so well in parts of the film. And that became the basis of a second book, Confront and Conceal. And by the time I sort of had made my way through the first years of the Trump administration, I realized that what we were sort of missing out here was a book that explained how this had moved from the periphery of national security to the center of national security. That it was no longer going to be sort of a side topic that you sort of dealt with, you know, there's the military, and then over here is cyber, but that this is the day-to-day way that countries undercut each other, seek power against each other, and conduct short-of-war operations. And the reporting I had been doing over the years, from Olympic Games through to the Sony hack, through the OPM, through to what the Iranians had done to the financial system, and then what we were doing as Cyber Command was growing, became really the basis of the reporting in the book. As soon as the book was done, I got a call from the then president of HBO saying, we've been trying to do cyber forever, and you can't make a movie with a bunch of guys in hoodies leaning over a keyboard. And so they wanted to get the book, and we made that arrangement. They found a terrific director in John Maggio, who would never put somebody in a hoodie leaning over a keyboard in one of his scenes. Instead, he'd go find people like Amy and many others, and has done this as sort of a popular movie, popular documentary that focuses on the victims and makes this a much more human story, I think. And so we spent really the past 18 months doing this. It's a different documentary than we had in mind, Ben. We had in mind going to China, Russia, taking you through Europe and all that. And some things happened along the way that made that impossible. So we had to sort of call an audible earlier this year and redesign what the documentary would look like.
I have a feeling before we're done in our discussion here, we'll talk about some of the intervening factors and how they too interact with this new world of cybersecurity that you described so well. Amy, the opening scene of this movie is Stuxnet. You're on camera early on the scene talking about Stuxnet, which was the name the cybersecurity community used for this attack on Iran. The attack had two mechanisms: one, manipulating the speed of the Iranian centrifuges; the other, manipulating the pressure of the uranium hexafluoride gas. Incredibly ingenious, as you describe in the film, with this sort of heist-like surveillance video trick that they pull. It's been 10 years since that attack became public in the summer and fall of 2010, 8 years since David's seminal story that indicated it was an American and Israeli joint operation. With the benefit of hindsight and academic perspective, how do we think of Stuxnet today? What's the significance of Stuxnet in this broader geopolitical landscape that David describes?
Well, I'm not surprised, Ben, you start off with a real softball question. Let me just say thank you for having me. I wish I were there in person. For those of you who don't know, Ben and Fiona Cunningham have a terrific piece if you want to look at cyber escalation and dynamics between China and the US. It's a great new piece I just read over the weekend in the Texas National Security Review. And let me just say one thing about David Sanger before I answer your question, Ben. David is the model of why journalists write the first draft of history. As you know, and we're in this cyber world, so much is so highly classified. Academics really rely on the amazing reporting that David has done to help us understand what this world is about. So it's a heroic effort on his part that we all benefit from. So kudos to you, David. I was glad to be the first trial cast of the first movie. I'm sure there'll be many more movies to come. They'll upgrade the cast. But in answer to your question about Stuxnet, what have we learned? Well, I think, Mike Heaton has said, as only Mike Heaton can say, when Stuxnet happened, it had the whiff of 1945 about it. And what he meant by that was, just like the use of the first atomic weapon in Japan by the United States, he knew in that moment this was something very new. That's not to say he wouldn't have done it again. And, if you roll back the clock, I doubt many policymakers would say, you know what, we shouldn't have done it. It is to say that they recognize that this was opening a new era. And we've seen with dramatic speed how that era has morphed into threats that we never envisioned 10 years ago.
And David, I'm curious what the US government thinks about Stuxnet. Do we have any sense of that? Amy is quite right that she and I get to be academics and free ride in many respects on your reporting, or contextualize it, as we would say. So I'll put this question to you. What does the US government think of this? Do we have a sense of behind closed doors, how they view this operation and the era that it kicked off?
Well, we know a few things. We know that when President Obama inherited this from President Bush, and was sitting down in the Situation Room, sort of picking centrifuge hall targets in the same room where Lyndon Johnson had sat picking targets in Vietnam. At one point, he turned to his staff and he said, one day this is all going to get out. I don't think he planned on it getting out quite as quickly as it did, but he said, one day it'll get out. And when it does, every country that's attacking us anyway, and every country that would like to, or like to have an excuse to, will cite this as the reason they can go do it. And he sort of had the sense that they were walking off this cliff, but they didn't have a choice, because their other choice was bomb it, send in saboteurs. They were all very risky, and the chances of starting a war were pretty high, whereas they thought they could get away with this for some period of time, and they were right. So when people did the battle action, after action report, what they learned was a few things. First, the physical effects were somewhat limited. They took out 1,000 of the 5,000 centrifuges that were around at that time. It set the Iranians back by roughly a year. I've heard people argue, 8 months versus 18 months, but put it somewhere in the middle. But by the time the Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2015, they had 19,000 centrifuges. So the response the Iranians had was to go sort of full speed ahead. So in that regard, I would say it wasn't an entire success. The psychological import of it, though, I think was huge, because it told the Iranians, we are inside your system. We probably couldn't have gotten there without insiders in your system. So you have traitors who are wandering around in all of this. If we did it once, we can do it again. And so in the minds of people in the Obama administration, it helped drive the Iranians to the negotiating table. And that's probably why a building right next to the Natanz plant, one where advanced centrifuges were being built, mysteriously blew up last June. An operation we think, again, was part of the Israelis and part of this same psychological sense that, you guys, to us, you're like mowing the lawn. We're going to come back, and if you build it up, we're going to knock it down again. And the big question, which you and Amy have helped illuminate so well, and I always tell people after they're done reading my book and they say, okay, now I'd like to actually go to something with some intellectual integrity on this, I say, well, go read Hacker in the State. The point that you and Amy have written about so well is this escalatory or de-escalatory? And we don't really know yet. And under the different conditions, it can go different ways. And I can say this, and we'll get back to what's happening in the election, I'm sure, later on in the discussion. But we've spent a huge amount of time and effort and billions of dollars in the past few years to deter the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese, particularly from coming into our election system. And from my quick glance at the headlines, like this morning, I'm not sure that's an entirely successful operation at this point.
We will certainly come back to the deterrence question, especially around election security, because I think it's important. Let's stick with Iran for 1 second, Amy. I think the film moves on. We hear about the Iranian response. The film talks about this devastating attack against Sands Casino in February of 2014. Even prior to that, the Iranians had launched a series of denial of service attacks against American financial institutions in the summer and fall of 2012. They launched an attack against Aramco, the most valuable company in the world, destroying 35,000 computers in the summer of 2012. It's pretty clear Iran punches back after Stuxnet. And I think what's remarkable to me is how quickly they do that, and they gain the capability to do that. And Amy, you're a political scientist. I think this illuminates a really important political science question, which we're always thinking about the asymmetry of technologies and whether a technology allows a state to catch up. Should we learn from what happened with Iran that this is a distinctive feature of cyber operations, that it allows basically a weaker state to punch back just as hard pretty quickly?
Absolutely, Ben. And there's another part of the movie where we see this with North Korea, right? So one of the poorest countries in the world, able to wage this bizarre hack on Sony Pictures Entertainment, which becomes a huge issue for the Obama administration. And as you know well, and you've written about, one of the distinguishing features of cyberspace compared to natural domains like air, sea, and land, on which we're used to fighting, is that it gives powerful countries asymmetric vulnerabilities. So the United States is the most powerful actor in cyberspace, and we're simultaneously the most vulnerable actor in cyberspace because we're so digitally connected. And that is unique to cyberspace. If you think about, in the Navy, right, the country with the best and most ships is going to have naval supremacy. Same thing in the air, same thing on the ground. Cyberspace is not that way at all. And that is hard to wrap our arms around. And I think it's one of the reasons why the US has been relatively slow to adapt to the vulnerabilities and threats that we face in cyberspace, because it's so fundamentally different than any other domain on which we've had to fight before.
David, Amy drew this link between Iran and North Korea. That brings us to this other great work of cinematography besides The Perfect Weapon. I'm speaking, of course, of The Interview, the Seth Rogen and James Franco comedy, I guess is the word. And of course, as the film shows, North Korea is very upset about this movie, which features a scene of the sort of gruesome death of its leader, Kim Jong-un. Tensions build throughout 2014. They carry out an attack on Sony in November of 2014. You've done some reporting for the New York Times, David. I'd like you to share it with us about how North Korea developed these capabilities and what it took for a nation that was kind of a laughingstock or a backwater of cyber operations not that many years before to build up pretty substantial capabilities, because they could destroy 70% of the computers at Sony. Can you take us through their evolution and capabilities?
Sure. So it's pretty remarkable, as Amy points out in the film. At the time they did this, what did you say, Amy? They had like 28 websites or something like that?
28 websites in the whole country, yeah.
Yeah, and they probably had fewer IP addresses than you have been in the building, at Georgetown. And I know they had fewer IP addresses than any block in Palo Alto, as Amy could indicate. Okay.
Probably than any apartment in Palo Alto, I would say.
Yeah, that's probably true. Okay. So it is pretty remarkable that they look at cyber and they suddenly say, okay, at one end, we've got nuclear weapons, expensive, hard to do, plutonium, uranium, big sites that people are always thinking about bombing. And then we've got cyber. And what are the characteristics of cyber that make them absolutely ideal for North Korea? First, it's dirt cheap. If you're broke, cheap is good, okay? Second, it gives them something they can actually use, because the nuclear weapon, fearsome as it may be, and while it may have propelled them into international notoriety, they can only use it once and only enjoy its use for about 45 minutes, right? Whereas cyber, they can dial up, they can dial down. Their only problem was they didn't have enough bandwidth coming in and out to actually be able to launch an attack from North Korea. So they send a young hacker who was trained partly in China. He assembles a team. They go to China, Thailand, Malaysia, and they work for a few months on very patiently hacking into Sony, which had virtually no protections about it. And they managed to get in, and they're patient. I mean, this is really the amazing thing. They don't just like break in and start knocking over the lamps. They look at how every part of the system is linked to everything else, the emails, the film archive, the production section, the payroll section, the whole bit. They see how it's all linked together. They publish a few of the emails. This is 2 years before the Russians got around to doing this in the 2016 election. It's from these emails that we learned the vital national security news that Angelina Jolie can be extremely difficult to work with on the set. And then they strike right around Thanksgiving. And as you point out, took out about 70% of Sony's computer systems. Now think of the alternative here. If they didn't have cyber, they would have had to land a bunch of saboteurs at Long Beach, get an Uber, go up to Sony, get on the little tour with, you know, the kids, right? Split off, stick dynamite under the computer center. They might not have destroyed 70% of it. And if there were CNN photos of smoke rising over the Sony lot, you know that whoever was president was going to have to make something blow up in Pyongyang. So they quickly understood its strategic value. And it's pretty impressive. And that's one of the reasons, apart from the fact that it was the opportunity to get both Seth Rogen and Hillary Clinton into the same documentary, that we went and interviewed Rogen.
So can I just add here, Ben? So I think
sure,
David has talked about a really important point that I think can get overlooked, which is that Sony had left the doors wide open. Right. So the North Koreans were ingenious. Yes, they were created before the Russians, but Sony really didn't do a whole lot to protect anything in that company. So
That's right.
Passwords were stored in a file called passwords. The doors were literally open. Sony's parent company had been the victim of a massive hack just a few years before, and they didn't learn from that experience. So it's not like it was a pure bolt from the blue. The parent corporation had experience with a massive cyber breach or cyber attack before and didn't learn from it in time. So one technologist often jokes that advanced persistent threat sometimes comes to mean advanced means we hadn't thought of it, and persistence means we can't get rid of it. So there is a dimension where the victims are sometimes leave the doors wide open to these kinds of attacks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that shows up in all of the writing that I think the three of us have done is that these companies that at this point should know, really are on the front lines of a lot of the statecraft, whether it's Sands Casino or Aramco or Sony or telecom companies. These are not international disputes that are resolved in debating chambers at the United Nations. They're often resolved in corporate or private networks. David, one thing that didn't make the movie that I think it's too good to not use here, it is in the book version. So this is, you want to see the movie and also read your book, is when an aide is briefing President Obama about the Sony attack. I believe this is in the Oval Office, as you report. The aide says, "Sir, I never thought I'd be here briefing on a bad Seth Rogen movie." And Obama says, "How do you know it's a bad movie?" And the aide says, "Sir, it's a Seth Rogen movie." So I think this is the kind of color that gets dropped when he comes up into your movie. But certainly does a good job, I think, in your book of making this, as ever, a human story.
So Ben, it turns out Obama likes Seth Rogen movies. I mean, who knew? Okay. He was not willing to go to war to defend Sony, as Amy points out in the thing, but he does like the Seth Rogen movies.
I wouldn't have had it pegged, but I'm sure a Netflix recommendation algorithm could figure that out.
Yeah.
Who knew? Amy, I do have a more serious question for you about the Sony hack. One of the things that's striking about this hack is, as David said, is that it's an attack, but it's also a hack and leak. And I'm curious, does that illuminate something that's fundamentally different about cyber operations from other kinds of military operations, where you've got this tight linkage between espionage and attack? And if so, what are the political science or security studies consequences of that operational difference?
Well, this is something, Ben, I think you've done some really great work on. One of the big problems in cyberspace is that it's really hard to know when a weapon is a weapon, right? So an intrusion looks 90% the same, whether it's an intelligence operation, whether it's defending your own cyber networks, or whether you're actually going offensive to attack another network. And as you write about in the preparation of the environment. And so that means that it's it's an environment that is prone to miscalculation. The miscalculation risks are higher because if you detect an intrusion, you don't know what the adversary is doing. So what does that mean for intelligence? It means a few things. Number one, it means that intelligence about context, about intentions and capabilities and the geopolitical context is all the more important in cyberspace than it is in physical space. Number two, it means that the intelligence community has to have much more intelligence, whether it's on for defensive purposes or offensive purposes. Because unlike the physical space, in physical space, you can draw up a target list and you can put it on a shelf. And because movies and missile silos don't move very often. But in cyberspace, of course, you plug in a thumb drive or you patch your Windows operating system and suddenly the battle space is completely different. And so in order to have good intelligence, it has to be ubiquitous, has to be global, it has to be real time. That is an enormous demand for the intelligence community. And it's something that I think they're struggling with and will continue to have to deal with in the cyber world.
Hey, Ben, just to take another slice at that, I agree completely with Amy. When you think about the effect on the public, it's also got a completely different view depending on who's going into who else's system. So we see the Russians sitting in our utility grid and people freak out and say, oh my God, they're going to turn off all the electricity from Boston to Washington, which I actually don't think the Russians would do because that's one of the few things that would raise them up above the level of short of war and probably result in a visit from some B-2s or something. But who knows? They're a nuclear power, so maybe we would take it. When we call our new strategy persistent engagement or active defense or whatever, what's its element? That we're going into foreign networks and lurking there, maybe to collect intelligence, as Amy just said, but it's like a port being put into you by a doctor. It can be used to go examine what's happening inside your body, or it can be used to apply chemotherapy, right? And it's all a question of what your intent of using it is. And we fully expect that the rest of the world will say, oh, those Americans, they're just in our network to look around. Don't worry about a thing. And yet when they're in our network, as we've just reported that the Russians have actually made their way into a few registration systems in the United States, voter registration systems, just as they did 4 years ago, our mind turns to the worst possibility.
Just, Ben, if you have students watching, right, this is a classic cognitive trap that we fall into, where we attribute the worst case scenario, the dispositional variable. They meant to do this to an adversary, but we think that we can explain away, we're the good guys and they must know it. We're driven by our situation to behave that way. And so there's a fundamental disconnect there. And the example I always use with my students is when students get an A in a class, they say, I got an A. But when they get a C, they say, that professor gave me a C. That's exactly the same dynamic that David just described in cyberspace.
That's a good one. That captures it well. Amy, not only do we—
This is why I won't take Amy's class.
all three of us teach, and I think Amy has a reputation for having the highest standards of the three of us, I'm sure. Not only, Amy, do we have students watching, a lot of them have their comprehensive exams next week, in which the security dilemma, Thucydides trap, all of that certainly will appear. So for the students, this counts as studying. Jordan, I think we've got a clip I want to show as we talk about Chinese espionage here. Can we share the OPM clip?
Google says it and at least 20 other companies were victims of a targeted cyber attack originating in China.
A very sophisticated cyber attack on the health insurer Anthem.
This intrusion is once again the work of state-sponsored espionage groups based in China.
And then the Chinese escalated. They spent a year inside the Office of Personnel Management, the most boring bureaucracy in America.
They stole 22 million files of highly classified security clearance applications.
That is an intelligence nightmare. The Chinese now have all sorts of detailed information about your family members, foreign friends that you may have, that could be used to actually recruit assets for the Chinese government sometime in the future.
Amy, let's start with you and that quote from you at the end there. We're talking here about the breach in the Office of Personnel Management, tens of millions of security clearance files. You cited a lot of intelligence operations, counterintelligence, intelligence oversight. How bad is this, and why is it so bad?
Ben, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's probably a billion, right? It's really bad. And if you combine the OPM, the Chinese didn't stop with OPM, right? So the Chinese are responsible, we believe, for the Anthem hack, right? Or the Equifax hack. And so what you're seeing is a vacuuming up of all sorts of data that can be put together using emerging technologies like machine learning to develop a picture of who is able to be recruited for the Chinese side. So it's even worse than just a single hack. And as you know, these SF-86 forms, these security clearance forms, have even more than what I described in the movie. They have your medical history. They might have compromising information about whether you've had psychological counseling or drug addiction, or, as we've seen in the press, debt, right? If you have a lot of debt, that can make you prone to being recruited by a foreign nation. So, there's a reason Director of National Intelligence Jim Clapper got in trouble for this, but he went, in public saying, salute the Chinese. We'd do that if we could too, right? It was sort of professional, hats off to the Chinese, because it was so damaging and so successful on their side.
David, why haven't we been able as a nation to stop this Chinese espionage? It seems to me to be a classic activity short of war in the way that you described. I remember May 2014, reading the New York Times, your story about indictment of 5 Chinese PLA hackers by the Department of Justice. This breach was either underway or about to be underway when that indictment came down. There's been a whole slew of indictments since then, as Amy said, for Equifax. Why hasn't this been something the United States can stop?
Well, there's sort of 2 questions there. One is, why haven't we stopped the Chinese theft of intellectual property issues? And the second question is, why has our broader deterrence sort of failed? So let me take those in order. On the China side of this, part of it was we've done a terrible job of identifying what it is we most need to protect. So think about this. We locked down the CIA, we locked down the Pentagon, we locked down the military industrial complex, even though, of course, the Chinese ended up stealing the blueprints for the stealth fighters and so forth. So sometimes we lock it down too late, but we lock it down. So what happens at OPM? As I say in the film, it's the most boring bureaucracy in Washington. And so no one bothered to go ask themselves the question, where do we keep the results of our security clearance files? And the answer was OPM. And then if you followed that string for a little while, as we did as the hack went on, it turned out OPM wasn't actually holding their own files. Well, where were they? Well, Congress, in its best of intentions, had said, before you go spend money on mass storage of government data, go use empty storage space elsewhere in the government. Seems to make sense. We're all trying to save money. So they put these security files at the Department of the Interior, which is, accustomed to protecting vital information like bison migration in Yellowstone. Okay, so the Chinese follow the string through here, and they spent a year clearing out the Department of the Interior's files. And so I come in and I ask the question, when we're doing this investigation, were they encrypted? And they give me 60 different reasons why you don't need to encrypt the data. Well, it turned out, as we learned, the Chinese encrypted it on the way out so that we wouldn't see what they were stealing. Okay. And then it gets better. This could only happen in the US government. About 3 or 4 months after they gave me the explanation about why they weren't encrypting data, a friend of mine says, if you looked in the Federal Register today, and I said, I don't usually read it every morning. He said, well, you might want to flip through it today because there's a contract being let to encrypt all of the data. So I wrote about this and sort of tongue in cheek, suggested that they give the contract to the Chinese since they'd already done the work. And I get a call from a lawyer at OPM who, must have missed irony class in high school, says, well, Mr. Sanger, we're not allowed to give contracts to foreign states. And I said, I think you are missing something here. So our brain is in the wrong place about how to protect it. On the other side of this, indictments are great if you can show that every once in a while you can get one of these people and put them in jail. But we haven't done that very often. The counter strikes are good, but we've been very careful because we don't want to go over that red line that causes military action either. So I think the Chinese have done the very careful cost-benefit analysis and say, well, supposing they indict 5 more officers. Yeah, it's embarrassing, but look at the yield that we get. We get OPM. We get the health data from Anthem. We get Marriott, which tells us where everybody stayed, right? Or Starwood, which was later purchased by Marriott. And we get Equifax, and we put it all together for the biggest picture of the elite who have security clearances in the United States, where they are, who they know, how to blackmail them, where they're traveling, what they worked on.
It's a remarkable operation. I think it shows I don't know if you want to talk about mobility or the scale of information. I always think of Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers. When he decided to leak those, he spent the next year photocopying, because just moving one copy of the Pentagon Papers was such an endeavor in terms of moving the information. Now, gigabytes of information on hundreds of millions of people, at least in the case of Equifax, can move so quickly. Speaking of information moving, it gets a little bit of a play in the film, David, but I think we can do more justice to it here and go still deeper. What's up with this case called the Shadow Brokers? Who is it, if you know, and what happened in the summer of 2016?
So we wish we knew. We know that the NSA's, National Security Agency's, sort of prize tools that came out of what was then called the Tailored Access Operations Unit, the unit that breaks into foreign computer systems. The code begins to get published in the summer of 2016. Now, many Americans didn't pay any attention. We had another little presidential race underway at the time. But what happened with this code ultimately was that the North Koreans took a good deal of it and used it to design what became the WannaCry attack that took out the British healthcare system. The Russians took other parts of it and used it to design NotPetya, the most damaging by commercial value of all of the hacks we've seen so far, that even flew back on some Russian entities. It went so wide. And when we wrote about this, I basically said, look, if we had lost something in the physical world, like a missile, the design for a missile, and it got shot back at an ally, there'd be court-martials. But because we so overclassify cyber, because we wrap it in so much secrecy, the immediate instinct of the US government was, let's not acknowledge these weapons are ours. Let's not punish anybody. Let's not start any public inquiries. Nothing to see here. Keep moving on. And I think that gets to a much bigger issue, which is the secrecy we have around our cyber capabilities is actually getting in the way of our deterrence. It's also getting in the way of our ability to protect this stuff. Now, do I think insiders walked out with it? Yeah, by and large, I do. I'm not sure it's the insiders the US has so far identified.
Amy, you've written a lot, book Eyes on Spies, about the intelligence community, intelligence oversight, intelligence reform. I think it was Mike Hayden who said, after this case and after these capabilities were used in part to enable the NotPetya attack, I hear a lot of arguments about why the US shouldn't have these offensive operations. One of the few that I might buy is that if we can't keep the stuff secret, we can't keep it secure, our adversaries can pick it up and use it. That might be an argument to use, that we should use these less and do less. Do you buy that? What's the lesson for intelligence community oversight and reform from the shadow brokers?
I think, Ben, there are a couple lessons. One is that counterintelligence is growing exponentially more difficult in the current technological era, right? So you think, right, so the shadow brokers, we don't know who revealed the information, but assuming that there were insiders involved, right, that's a counterintelligence problem. And during the Cold War, when we had traitors, it took years for them to smuggle documents out in their pants, right? Now you can have incredibly damaging information at scale revealed very quickly, right? So Edward Snowden, is estimated to have stolen and illegally released 1.5 million highly classified documents. Again, a treasure trove of NSA programs revealed. So there are enormous problems with keeping our secrets secret today, and the scale of damage is much bigger than it has been in the past. That's just a problem for counterintelligence generally. I think, there are a number of other issues with respect to the shadow brokers. And I think the bigger issue, and we're seeing it play out in real time, Ben, in this election, is who are the decision makers that need to be supported by intelligence? So intelligence, as David said, is hardwired to operate in secret. But in this cyber era today, the intelligence community has to actually transform itself to operate, in some cases, much more in the open. Right, so we saw the press conference last night. We've seen other sort of public service announcements from intelligence officials. Decision makers today are not just generals and presidents with security clearances in meeting in secured rooms. Decision makers today include us, right? Voters, tech company leaders. And so this is a whole new orientation for the intelligence community. I think David is exactly right that secrecy over classification is impeding progress on not just the cyber front, but the use of intelligence to defend the country. And so that's going to require fundamental reform, new products, new cultures, new processes to produce intelligence for decision makers that include all of us.
For those who are interested,
Ben, I just
David,
add to that quickly that, in the nuclear age, it's the US government and the intelligence community that had a complete monopoly on the data, right? I mean, they had the satellites, they could look at the missiles moving around. When there's a hack of a voter system, of a company, of whatever's happening, it's more likely or as likely to be picked up first by Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit or Google's Advanced Threats Unit or Facebook or Apple or you name it, right? And so when the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, threatened a month ago to cut off Congress from the intelligence briefings about the election, it was hard not to laugh, because it's not as if there are other sources that they couldn't get to that would also be able to go detect this activity.
Yeah, and one of the remarkable things I think about studying this is that there's this whole cadre of people who actually can talk. Many of them are in this film: Dmitry Alperovich, Don Hultquist, folks like that who work at these companies, and they can shed light, I think, on how this world works. Jordan, let's move to election interference here, and Jordan, maybe we can share the second clip from the film. If we've got it, Jordan. If not, I can just ask the questions.
Just one moment.
All right. So I'll say while we cue this up here, one of the, I think the things that's so striking about this movie, of course, is you had no idea what was going to happen last night, but you can see it ties in directly.
16 hours since the Iowa caucuses began. We're still waiting for the result.
The app didn't work. No one knew if it would.
This is so far not so good.
Iowa was exactly my worst fear.
The biggest concern was that voters would not be able to trust the system.
What about the confidence in the vote?
Especially against the backdrop of the Russian interference in 2016.
What Iowa is demonstrating to adversaries in the United States is all they have to do is create that appearance, and they probably don't even have to create their own disinformation. American partisans will do it for them.
The president's son was saying it's rigged. The president's campaign manager.
The Biden campaign is out there openly saying they don't trust what the results will be.
They've created what's called a perception hack. Our mind immediately goes to the question, are the Russians messing with our election? It doesn't matter whether they are or they aren't.
This is one of the confusing aspects of election security. It's not just about trying to hack into computers. There's another aspect of election interference that's about trying to hack into your brain. They're ultimately trying to get the American people to lose confidence in the system, that the system is beyond repair, that the system is broken, and their vote doesn't matter.
U.S. officials have now told Senator Bernie Sanders that Russia is trying to help his presidential campaign.
How did you think it came out now if you had the briefing a month ago?
Well, I'll let you guess about one day before the Nevada caucus. Why do you think it came out? Was the Washington Post? Good friends.
Joe, what do you say to the Russians?
Coming. They're continuing to meddle. They're involved in this race and in my primary. They're involved going after me on Facebook. They've already been taken down because Putin knows me and I know him and he doesn't want me to be president.
The Russians want everyone in this country to mistrust everything. Whether or not the Russians are involved, these next few months are going to be tense.
All right, David, we hear from Jake Tapper at the end there. Next few months are going to be tense. It's been a tense few months. Here we are, 12 days to go before the election. Big election news last night. Big breaking news from you just a few minutes ago or an hour or so ago about U.S. government thoughts on Russian election interference activities or potential for Russian election interference activities. What should we think about this?
Well, as Jake said there, the next few days are going to be tense, right? Okay. So what we report, last night you had the Director of National Intelligence say that the Iranians had been responsible for these intimidation emails that showed up in Florida and Alaska and some places. And as you dug into it, could well be the Iranians. They routed this stuff through Saudi Arabia and Estonia, but that's a standard thing if you're trying to hide your tracks. And along the way, they used data that you could publicly get from election authorities. That Ben Buchanan is registered and here's his party registration. Some places in Florida also keep your email address. So they didn't necessarily have to hack into anything. But when you send that intimidating email and you write in it, we know everything about you, we'll know exactly how you vote, you can create that perception of greater power. The Russians, we've just reported, are back inside or right adjacent to some of the election infrastructure. They've taken a hacking group that had focused on the utilities and put them focused instead on cities and towns. And again, they don't need to break into the whole system. They don't need to break into all of Wisconsin. All they need to do is dig themselves in enough to a few key cities and towns in a few key states that we consider to be, right on the edge. And that will create the perception that they're in the entire state. And then, of course, the fear is that President Trump or someone else says, well, clearly this was a rigged election, just like I said, when in fact, they were barely into a few places. And that's going to be the huge challenge for all journalists and many academics in the next few weeks, which is sorting out what's real and what's just designed to make you think that the hackers were much more powerful than they really are.
There's a saying that's long been around the elections business that elections have two purposes. The first is to pick the winner. The second is to convince the loser and the loser's supporters that their candidate has lost. Amy, David almost got the easy question. You get the harder question. What should we do about this? What should the United States government do to ensure the integrity of not just this election, but elections going forward, given the dangers of this kind of perception hacking?
So thanks for giving me the hard question there, Ben. I think there's not just what can the US government do, right? So there are three key players in this ecosystem. One is voters, right? And what voters can do for each other and to exercise caution and skepticism when they read things. The second is the government, and I'll get to that. But the third, and the piece we haven't talked about, is what can the mainstream media do? So one of the things, and I have two great colleagues at Stanford, Janine Zakaria and Andy Grotto at the Cyber Policy Center, that have been working hard on a playbook to give to mainstream media organizations about how to deal with this new world. So for example, and David lives this, so he can speak to it better than I can, but the norms in journalism are if you authenticate the veracity of information, you put it out there. And the provenance is a less important value in a story. Well, that's not true anymore. And the provenance is the story, right? What is the motive of the Russians for getting information? What is the motive of the Iranians, whether it's hack and release, whether the information is true or not? The Hunter Biden story in the New York Post. You're seeing an improvement in some coverage where it's skepticism about what's the motive behind this whole thing, but it's not pervasive. And mainstream media organizations need to use a systematic playbook that really changes the norm behind just, is the information accurate or not, to, is the information being manipulated and weaponized in a way that we are helping inadvertently, and we shouldn't be doing that. So I think that's what the media can do. And in terms of what can the government do, I mean, we see some of it, right? These public service announcements, which are meant to both alert and reassure at the same time. That's a hard balance to strike, right? There are threats everywhere, but rest assured your vote will be counted, is kind of a hard messaging acrobatics move to make. But beyond that, there's, over the long term, much greater partnership, and we see improvement here, but much greater partnership, as David alludes to, with the private sector, so that we have a better sense of what these threats are before it's too late. So back in 2016, you know, the first people to figure out that Russia was inside Facebook were Facebook people, right? Alex Stamos and his team. So that's getting better, but we need to do even more on that front. And then, of course, the sort of elephant in the room we haven't talked explicitly about is, does deterrence even work anyway in this space? Now, this is a big debate among policymakers and academics, as you know. I'm incredibly skeptical that we can ever have a deterrence scheme that can work to prevent malign actors from interfering in our elections, for three reasons, right? For deterrence to work, you need to have three things. You have to say what your red lines are, right? What's the behavior you won't tolerate? Well, President Obama told Vladimir Putin, there's a great picture in David's movie where they're, you know, face to, almost forehead to forehead. He said, we're not going to tolerate it. And guess what? We did. So it's hard to know where that threshold of war is. So we have to be able to state our red lines. That's hard in cyberspace. The second thing is we have to be able to identify the culprit. We have to do it fast. And that's often not easy either, right? So it's not enough to say eventually who's behind it. You have to be able to do it fast. And then the third thing is we have to be able to credibly punish in some way and let them know what we're going to do beforehand. As one former STRATCOM commander likes to say, strategic command, nuclear commander likes to say, we reveal to deter and we conceal to win. But we don't reveal to deter in cyberspace because, as you know, there are reasons why once you put what your capabilities are out there, they actually can become less effective, right? Because the target can take countermeasures that render your cyber weapon useless. So if you can't set red lines well, you can't attribute quickly, and you can't credibly threaten in a public way what you're going to do to punish somebody, it's hard to see how deterrence really has a stronghold in this space.
David, I want to turn to the story I think you alluded at the very beginning. COVID-19 makes it hard to make a documentary. Somehow you did it anyway. But I think it's also something that's, as you say in the movie, you know, this is the new jet engine design. This is the new item of interest for nations and their hackers. What have we seen in the months since the pandemic kicked off at this intersection of cyber operations and pandemic response vaccine development?
So we've got the Chinese, the United States, the Europeans, and some other countries all in this giant race to produce a vaccine, in part because obviously we've got a lot of sick people. We need vaccines to get our economies going, but it's also a source of soft power, right? If you're the Chinese and you can produce a working vaccine, doesn't even have to be a perfect vaccine, but a working vaccine, and begin distributing it all around the world, you have got an entree into building alliances or at least partnerships with countries that maybe weren't thinking about China as a partner before, and who might well be willing to overlook its human rights violations, its crackdown on Hong Kong, the new national security law, whatever they're doing in the South China Sea, whatever they might do to threaten Taiwan, because frankly, they're showing up with vaccine and someone representing Huawei offering to wire them with 5G networks at 0% interest. And oh, by the way, if you're a good authoritarian friend of ours, we'll throw in the facial recognition software for free. So, that's a pretty good way to win friends and influence people and begin to build a network that the United States leaves open by its withdrawal in recent years. And that's what I think Americans have somehow missed in the past 4 years, or some Americans have. That as the president has talked about pulling our military back to our borders, what it means is we're losing an opportunity to exercise influence. When America first becomes your mantra for distributing your vaccine, you make other countries think, well, if the Americans aren't going to share theirs with me for some time, who will? And somehow or another, we've got to get back to understanding what Tocqueville referred to as self-interest well understood. I think that maybe our view of self-interest right now is a little bit narrow. And it's no surprise that every other power would come in and try to steal these designs.
Amy, same question for you. How would you play the U.S. government hand here when it comes to COVID and its intersection with espionage?
Well, I think David's captured it quite well. I think the geopolitical stakes of COVID are so high. Who's going to be first off the mat, right? So whichever country is first off the mat economically will secure advantage. Whichever country is first off the mat politically will secure better relationships with allies and partners abroad. And we're already at a disadvantage here because we've let those relationships erode over the past several years. And whichever country is off the mat first is going to have an advantage when it comes to education and sort of the long game of technology, innovation, an educated workforce. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing rampant espionage for the vaccine because the geopolitical stakes are incredibly high. Oh, and by the way, this raises all sorts of questions about military readiness, right? We've seen how easy it is to disable a US aircraft carrier with a virus, right? So how do we rethink what the COVID pandemic means for how vulnerable we are to the human, right? We've been worried about AI and relying too much on AI in the cockpit and other places. What about the vulnerabilities of humans? So I think this is a critical moment for us to really rethink a lot of drivers of international security. And one of my intelligence friends has pointed this out to me. He said, this wasn't a man-made attack, right, the pandemic. But look at what we've learned about how much our infrastructures are linked in ways we never imagined before. Schools go down, which means people can't go to work, which means now they have to, to the extent they can, they have to work from home, which leaves us vulnerable to cyber attack at home on our home computers, which erodes our military readiness. All of these things, our infrastructures are linked in ways that we never could have imagined before. And so I think there's some real thinking we need to do on that front too.
I've got one more question for each of you. We already have some questions coming in from the audience that I've incorporated already, but audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function to type your question to me. Amy, let's start with you for the final question here. How much do we know? You and I are in this business of academia. You and I are in this business of putting things in context. One of my fears is that when we talk about cyber operations, in large part because of how secret they are, how complex they are, that it's just really hard to get a picture of what actually is happening. And I'm curious in your work and as you think about this, if you look back on the decade or so of operations that we've talked about here, how complete do you think that picture is? And how much of it you think is just out of view, not just to you, but for the rest of us out here in the public square?
It's such a great question, Ben. I fully understand the need for classification in these areas. At the same time, there is rampant overclassification in cyber. So as you know, even the phrase offensive cyber operations, the phrase was classified until the mid-2000s. That's crazy. So, there are a lot of comparisons to the Cold War that are not apt, but I think one of the ones that is when we think about how do we develop nuclear strategy during the Cold War. It was actually opening into the unclassified world development of things like game theory and mutual assured destruction. Academics didn't need to know the classified details about how to make a bomb, but we did need to know enough about how the government was thinking about doctrine, about policy, about organizational design to help make progress there. I would say still in cyberspace, there's much too much we don't know. Some for good reason, some for not good reason. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So we know that influence operations or information warfare, whatever you want to call it, is the new battleground. Well, what's the role of psychology at Cyber Command? How many psychological experts are they employing, and how are they thinking about psychology and the use of offensive cyber operations? Are they actually helping to direct research so that we can better understand how people misperceive or perceive information? I don't think we know enough about that. On the flip side, some of the most important actors in cyberspace aren't accountable to any voters at all, right? There are these corporations like Facebook and Google. Boy, I sure would like to know the organizational design of how they make policy, because that would help the government and the public improve sort of the offense and defense and functioning of cyber defenses. So the government could do more to open it up. I recognize it's a very difficult position for them to be in, but we can't help the government help all of us without greater transparency about things that really shouldn't give the crown jewels away, right? Which is the tactical aspects of cyber operations. We don't need to know that to contribute.
And David, you've got the flip side of this. As we said at the outset, you've broken a whole number of major stories on cyber operations over the last decade or so. I am curious what the biggest mystery to you is. What's the story you haven't been able to get? What's the fact you want to know? The thing that we should see as a coming attraction for the next book and the next movie?
I always figure, Ben, that wandering around Washington, I've got a command of fully like 5% of what's going on, right, at any given time. And in cyber, it may be less than that. But Amy gets at a really critical point, which enables me to answer your question, which is that in the nuclear age, everything about how we built a nuclear weapon, where you store them, who's got authority to launch, and that was all kept classified. And yet we still had a big rip-roaring debate about how to use them, right? One that, we went from MacArthur wanting to use it against the Chinese and the North Koreans to Eisenhower saying nuclear weapons were just another bullet in the arsenal. And then by the late 80s, we were all in agreement that we would only use nuclear weapons to basically preserve the state. For cyber, we're in the reverse space here. We're using them all the time, or they're being used against us all the time. And until the United States government is willing to talk about how it's using them, even if it keeps out some of those details that are analogous to the nuclear case, and the rules under which it's using them, and when it won't use them, and how often it's using them, and how often we're seeing our adversaries use it, we're never going to have that discussion about whether we should or under what conditions we should do that. And frankly, I think that's because there are a lot of people in the intelligence community and the Defense Department who don't want to have that discussion because they don't want to limit a future president's ability to use cyber the way Presidents Bush and Obama used it in Olympic Games. They don't want to say, well, sir, I know you don't want to turn off it would be unpleasant to turn off the lights in Iran, but we might need to conduct a cyber attack to do that as an alternative to bombing. And so if they get into a norm that says we're all in agreement that we won't touch civilian power plants, the president is suddenly limited. So what would I love to know? I'd love to know the real inner debate inside the United States about when we will, when we won't, where those red lines are. And frankly, unless we do that out in public, because we're a democracy, we're never really going to resolve those issues in people's minds.
David, I think that's an excellent teaser for what I'm sure is book number 4. So we look forward to you finding that out and telling us so Amy and I can write about it. We've got a bunch of questions here and not a ton of time. So Amy, I'll start with you on this one briefly. Is there any value to norms and openness? I think David was talking about the value of openness. What about norms and multilateral fora in cyber operations? Any prospects for dialing back some of this competition there?
Look, I think norms can be incredibly powerful, but they're very difficult, obviously, in cyberspace because cyberspace cyberspace is sort of the perfect secret battleground where you can hide what you're doing, you can hide who's doing it. So, and every nation has an incentive actually not to establish norms. That said, I do think we have to push harder on global norms. And there are a couple areas that I think are really most promising. Number one is on what areas do we have strong mutual interest with the Chinese? You could imagine that attacks disrupting the global financial services sector would be something that the Chinese would be very much against, as would the United States. Those two powers coming to an agreement on norms about financial cyber attacks could go a long way. So that's one where not multilateral, but let's start with bilateral. Let's start with the bilateral low-hanging fruit. That's one. Number two, which is something that, as you know, a lot of academics are worried about, norms about cyber intrusions in nuclear systems. So when conventional and nuclear command and control systems are commingled, that can be a very unstable situation where you see a cyber intrusion, maybe it's intended for a conventional system, and the target perceives that it's trying to dismantle command and control of a nuclear system, and there's an incentive to launch that nuclear weapon before you lose it. So I think that's a second area where it would be really important to develop some cyber norms. And then the third area is an area I've been thinking a lot about, but have not yet written about, that takes its lesson from the intelligence playbook, which is during the Cold War, the Soviets and the United States came to an understanding about how the espionage world would operate, right? They catch an American on Soviet soil that's supposed to be a diplomat, but is actually a clandestine case officer. That person gets PNG'd, persona, they leave. They're not incarcerated, they're not executed, right? Same thing in the United States. But this was no multilateral agreement. There's nothing written on paper. There wasn't a UN convention. This is a tacit understanding developed over years of bilateral experience. It's much like rules in basketball, right? Why do you only do a full court press at the end of a game for the most part? It's just kind of the way things work. So I think there are opportunities for developing tacit norms by experience on a bilateral basis, and we should put more effort into the bilateral prospects. In addition to thinking about, there's an excellent piece in Foreign Affairs by Maricha Shaki, for those of you who are interested, about multilateral efforts for like-minded democracies to establish norms in cyberspace. Those are important too, but I think the more promising immediate avenues are in the bilateral relationship space.
David, you describe OPM as the most boring bureaucracy in America. Obviously, we know in retrospect that it was incredibly important. What is something right now that we see as boring or out of the way, but where the cyber operations competition might move there next? Is it a medical information? Is it a different part of the bureaucracy? Where should we expect the game to go next?
Well, you touched on one, COVID, right? And that is generally medical information along the way, particularly as the world tries to all combat the same disease, and that's going to lead to some competition for the edge up. Amy touched on a second one, which is really hard to report on, but my colleague Bill Broad and I have tried at various moments and written a fair bit about, which is the nuclear command and control systems. Because if you can figure out a way to go neutralize somebody's nuclear missiles or their missiles before they have nuclear weapons on them, you can avoid billions of dollars in missile defense and so forth. So Amy points out we need sort of some norms that say we don't mess around. But the fact of the matter is we're already messing around. We reported, Bill Broad and I reported in the first few months of the Trump presidency that the United States had a big complex program, mostly during the Obama administration, to get inside the North Korean missile program. And what do you know, for a while, they had an 88% failure rate on their missile tests with a missile design that was very well understood. Now, not all of that was us. People make mistakes. We drop missiles into the soup all the time, but that was a remarkably high number. And we asked people at that time, well, okay, you did this with the North Koreans. We've since reported we've done it with the Iranians. Would you do it with the Chinese and the Russians? And people say, oh boy, would that be really dangerous? right? Because we do it to them, they start doing it to us, you get in exactly the problem Amy just described. Well, if you're the Russians or the Chinese and you see that Barack Obama and Donald Trump were perfectly willing to use cyber against the missile command and control systems of Iran and North Korea, you're not really going to sit back and say, well, they'd never do that to us. Of course not. So I think we've got a big problem there, and it's even larger now that we're modernizing the nuclear force, because we're finally getting rid of those old silos with the 5-inch floppy disks. But when you do, you introduce new vulnerabilities along the way.
This gets back, as so much of international affairs does, to the point that Amy made before of, you assume the best of yourself, you see the best in yourself, and you assume the worst in others. Again, a theme that has been in one form or another part of international politics for millennia. Last question goes to both of you. Amy, you can start here. There's a quote, this great quote at the end of the documentary. It closes the film about, the United States can start this, but the United States can't end it. Amy, how does this story end? How does this story of cyber competition between nations end, if it does?
Boy, I wish I had my crystal ball to give you a good answer to that, Ben. I don't know how it ends. I think there's going to be some real soul searching about how democracies appear to be asymmetrically vulnerable. I think the biggest worry I have, and David alluded to it, is the perception hack. And what's going to happen to perception hacks of the future? So if we look at what's technology coming down the pike, right? It's deception technology. It's stuff like deep fakes. It's natural language processing. So machines can write things that sound just like humans have written them, and it's going to be hard to tell the difference. What's truth and what's not? What confidence can we have in what we're understanding? How do we perceive what's going on in the world, whether it's a foreign adversary intervening in an election or something else? So in the old days, I think deception used to be an elite level game where leaders were trying to trick other leaders, and it was fair in wartime to try to deceive your adversary about when you might attack or where your troops were moving, right? We saw that with D-Day, right? That one of the best deception operations in history, right? Convincing Hitler that we weren't going to land at Normandy, right? And the deception was so amazing, Hitler refused to send reinforcements even days after we landed. So deception used to be fair game between leaders, but this is a different world. This is a world of deceiving the masses and reaching deep into the societies of powerful states to deceive all of us. So that's what I worry about most. I wish I could tell you there's a happy ending, but I'm really concerned it's going to get worse in terms of deception of the masses before it gets better. I hate to end on such a sad note, but maybe David will pick us all up with some optimism.
David, do you have an uplifting ending?
I'm always like Mr. Cheery, as you and Amy know. So I think when we do the after action report on this election, and we say, what's different in these perception hacks? What have we learned now that we didn't know in 2016? In 2016, it was us against the Russians. In 2020, it's us against us, right? Because suddenly what's happening in 2016 is that the United States, and in 2020, is that the United States has a president who has said, if I do not win, it's because someone cheated the system. And so we've created an incentive for all of our adversaries who want to go support him or think that they have some advantage in this or just want to cause chaos in the system to go prove his point that the system looks like it was hacked. And so what I worry about is that our biggest adversary right now in all of this is us. The fact that the IRA doesn't have to work, the Internet Research Agency doesn't have to work as hard anymore, but instead can basically amplify what the president is putting out about the dangers of mail-in ballots, tells you that we've got to solve our problem at home before we can solve this problem. The second thing I'd say, and the one other ray of hope, is that this may be an issue too important for governments, and that you're going to see NGOs, companies, others set those norms, those sets of behavior, just the way you saw the Red Cross force governments into the Geneva Conventions 80 years ago, 90 years ago, because they went and set a group of standards that everyone else began to accept. and government sort of had to pull up behind. And I suspect that's what's going to happen in cyberspace as well.
That's a happy note to end on. I will end on a more immediate happy note, which is thanking both of you for doing this. This is a lot of fun. As I said at the outset, I don't think we could find two better people to talk about these subjects. The person who wrote the book that prompted this movie, one of the stars of the movie, they've both done amazing work over the last number of years on this new world of cyber operations and statecraft. My only regret is that we couldn't do it in person. Next time, we'd love to actually do that in person, but we'll see how the COVID developments go. But for now, as Jake Tapper and David have said, it will be a tense few days, and it's been a real pleasure to talk about the next few days and all that led up to it with both of you. So thank you all very much, and thanks to everyone for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.